Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the current state of specification management. We'll give folks another 30 seconds to join and then we'll dive in. All right, good morning and welcome to our webinar on the state of specification management. Before we dive in, there's a lot that we could cover. In fact, I think Nancy, Kyle, and I could talk about specification management all day. So we're really going to use this time to highlight the report. If we take a look at our agenda, we're going to cover introductions, so you know who's on the phone here, go over the current state of specification management. I'll be honest, some of the data points really opened my mind on some of the problems that folks are facing, and I think you guys will really resonate with a lot of the data. We'll also talk about where to go from here. So how do you actually go about implementing specification management, figuring out where your organization stands and actually implementing it, and then at the end we'll take a few questions. So a packed agenda. Again, there's a lot we can cover, and we're going to go through these pretty quickly. I'm Laura Fody, Head of Marketing at SpecRite, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by our partners at Chainalytics, Nancy Matchey, the Vice President of Packaging Optimization, and Kyle Oss, Senior Manager of Packaging Optimization. We teamed up to study this topic because it's something we're both intimately familiar with. At SpecRite, we pioneered a new category of software purpose-built to manage specs and have witnessed the positive impacts it has on both people and companies. And of course, Chainalytics is one of the leading supply chain consulting firms and has helped companies put these systems and processes into place quickly. So thanks for joining us, Nancy and Kyle, and we're excited to have this discussion today.
Great to be here.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. So first, let's just give a quick overview of what a specification is. We're going to be using that word a lot today. If we look at a quick glance, finished goods, component drawings, bill of materials, raw materials, these are just some examples of specifications. And specifications are the universal language of the supply chain and really function as that binding contract between stakeholders, whether it be internal departments or with your suppliers, of agreeing upon what you're going to make and what you're expecting to receive. And what we really found is that today managing specs is so difficult because products and supply chains are increasingly complex. If we look at how we actually went about surveying the current state of specification management, we surveyed hundreds of supply chain professionals to understand how they're managing specs today. And we looked at under the umbrella of supply chain, we talked to packaging people and product development and quality and operations to really get a cross-functional perspective and also a cross-industry perspective. So we received responses from people in food and beverage, cosmetics and beauty, industrials, medical devices, and really found that a lot of the challenges are universal across all of these industries, which I find extremely fascinating. And of course, we had over 100 responses. So really grateful to everyone who participated and helped us create this valuable data set. So let's dive in and talk about some of the results. One of the first questions we asked is, what tools is your company using to manage specification data today? And what we found here is that most companies are managing specs with Excel, about 64%, Share Drive, and email. I think what's clear here, you'll notice these numbers don't add up to 100%. And that's because specs aren't really being managed in a single source of truth, but rather spread out across systems. Nancy, is this in line with what you've seen at some of your clients?
I have to say it absolutely is in line. There is no consistency, and while the need and the trend is going into a more away from the traditional and going into more technology-driven, obvious, logical solutions, we're certainly not there yet. So this is a great picture, and this is even inside the four walls of a company. You get outside where you're sharing your specs with other companies, and it can double and triple the pain in this category.
That's great, and we're actually going to talk about suppliers in just a little bit. The next question we asked folks is, what information do you document on your specifications? We obviously gave that quick overview of what a spec is, and I think what's really interesting is, in addition to basic data points like material descriptions and drawings, these are some of the traditional kind of obvious specification data points, we're also seeing companies start to track sustainability metrics, product usage, and supplier information. And to me, what this really shows is that specifications are starting to really drive and inform more decision making, right? A lot of companies are trying to measure sustainability, or they're trying to understand how often is a spec used, how effective is that specification in part, when it comes to sales or quality issues or so forth. Nancy and Kyle, when it comes to sustainability data in particular, what data do you see some of your clients capturing?
Yeah, great
First,
question. Many of our clients in this space are, looking to capture greenhouse gas emissions, right? How much are we consuming when it comes to recycled content and corrugated and folding carton? That becomes a key indicator as to how healthy they are from a sustainability standpoint. And taking trucks off the road is a direct impact of CO2, and oftentimes in our optimization studies, that's one of the areas that we're looking at outside of specs. And so when we look at actual specifications, there are some tangible measurements, and then there are others that are more difficult to calculate that we often find in our work.
yeah, and just to add to that, there's that baseline information that some companies just don't have. So they're certainly doing a lot of tracking and information gathering, and they're putting that into tools. And that's where SpecRite could certainly play a strong role, is that how do they know how they're progressing toward their sustainability goals? They have to have a baseline first. And so it's going to see that 29% grow over time. And so I'll look forward to the trend in that area.
That's awesome. Thank you both for that perspective. It reminds me of something our founder, Matthew Wright, says. He loves to say everything is a spec. And I think, as we talk about things like sustainability and supplier collaboration, that definition will continue to evolve and grow. So the next question we asked is, how many specs does your organization currently manage? And this really blew my mind. Almost half of people reported managing between 1,000 and 10,000 specs, and a whopping 25% reported managing more than 10,000 specs. Nancy, does the size of the company typically correlate with the number of specs they have to manage? What are you guys seeing?
I think you might think that, but that's not necessarily the truth. I think we see smaller companies with a large amount of specs, and we see large companies with a large amount of specs.
That's awesome. And I think, it really is due to that product complexity, right? It doesn't just impact the Fortune 500, but also those challenger brands that are looking to come in and disrupt. So interesting to see that this is certainly a problem across all size of companies. The next question we asked is, how often do your specifications require changes or revisions? And what we found is that specs are changing constantly. Not only are people managing more specs, but they're also updating them and revising them pretty frequently. The majority of people, 64% of respondents, said specifications require changes or revisions often or very often. And if you think about the impact of this across the supply chain, both internally, getting cross-department approval, communicating this to all of your suppliers, this can certainly lead to some snags. Nancy, have specs always changed this often, or are there trends driving the frequency that these are being updated?
Yeah, it's a great question, Laura. I think about this, and I think it's very company dependent. So you think about the governance and how you're managing the revisions of your specifications, and some companies are very rigid and very proper with how they create or revise a specification, and then there are revision levels within specifications. So the fact that they're changing often means maybe they have looser standards of when they create a new one versus when they can revise an old. And it's all about document control. So matter if there's new or an existing, there's change happening all the time.
That's great. And honestly, version control is one of the biggest pain points we hear when people are thinking about moving to SpecRite. So really interesting stuff. The next question that we asked, and Nancy, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, is we asked people, how do you communicate spec changes across the organization and or with your suppliers? And what we found is there's a tremendous reliance on email to communicate changes. 85% of professionals reported using email to send specification updates to suppliers, and even 21% relied on phone calls. I know personally, I've definitely missed an email or two here and there, and I can't imagine, relying on this for such a critical part of of my business. Nancy, what happens if specs aren't communicated correctly?
Yeah, I was surprised by this outcome. 85%, it's just too risky for your business. And so you've got changing specs and you've got people following up with phone calls, and they're often out of sync. The order came in with a spec that the supplier hasn't even received yet. So they're on revision 4, you're on revision 5. And what is going to be made, it's a huge risk to the business in the effect of what you really want the outcome to be.
That's great. And in fact, I mentioned our CEO earlier, but Matthew Wright actually started as a supplier. And I think he was the only person who wasn't surprised that 85% of people use email. And he's got plenty of stories about how he unfortunately got burned on the supplier side, where again, people arguing over which specification is correct and not being communicated and so forth. So, it's not just a negative impact for the brand, but in fact for suppliers as well. The next question we asked is, which departments does a specification pass through? And what we found is that specifications touch every part of the supply chain organization. And what's more, we just talked about how specifications are constantly changing and undergoing revisions. These aren't just a one-time activity. Every time it changes, this process has to restart. And when we look at who's involved, it's not surprising to see package engineering here, quality, procurement, but also different departments like regulatory compliance and even legal. And obviously, if you're using a variety of different systems like Excel or your ERP and relying on all these different formats, it can be hard to know where a specification is when it comes to a status or know who's approving it. And we've seen this create friction within organizations. Kyle, what are you seeing here?
Yeah, one thing that jumps out at me is, the breadth of the different functions that we're seeing in requiring approvals. In our optimization cycles at Chainalytics, we're frequently tapping into the key stakeholders across the supply chain. And so to see some of these functions in the data today is not surprising. With packaging engineering all the way through to legal, it's not uncommon for optimization cycles to touch on all of these different functions in the business.
That's great. And, one anecdote that someone told me recently that I thought was so interesting, someone I was talking to said that because so many people are involved and there's not a lot of visibility into who's approved it or where things stand, that oftentimes there can be a lot of friction within an organization. And they describe specification management as therapy within these different departments, right? Just by having that single source of truth where everyone can go in and see where something stands, really removing that friction and helping people work better together. I know during COVID, especially as people are working remotely, this is becoming more and more important. The next question we asked folks is, on average, how many hours a week do you spend on locating the correct specification? And this is, again, something that we kind of always knew in our gut, but really have been able to quantify. And it's that poor specification management is a productivity killer. 66% of people reported spending an average of 1 to 5 hours per week looking for specs. That's literally half of a workday just searching for information. Furthermore, 12% of respondents reported spending more than 5 hours a week. This can literally add up to multiple days a week spent searching for the correct information, and anywhere from 2 to 11 days a year for each individual spent. And if you add this up across teams and companies, they're potentially wasting weeks of employee productivity on non-value added items. Kyle, do you find that chasing data impacts the strategic work that your teams are tasked with?
Yes, time and accuracy is one of the key things in one of the ROIs that is used to make investments in this space. And wasting time searching and locating the right specs or items that could be used on different applications is common in terms of spec management and what can be done to improve inside our client's operation. Accuracy in the spec is the second piece of that, which oftentimes we find that our clients are able to locate the specs, but some of the information is inaccurate or out of date. And so those are just two of the ways that we're hearing about time being spent in the space.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest challenges that our customers come to us with. Oftentimes people say to me, Laura, I have Google for everything else in my life. Why is it so hard for me to search for specs? And that's searchability is actually probably the favorite functionality in spec, right? People love just having data at their fingertips, being able to search in a variety of different ways and having it take seconds and certainly not hours or even days. So interesting to see. The next question we asked is, what do you utilize specification data for? What initiatives are you using for this? And the old adage goes, you can't improve what you don't measure. And it turns out that specs can be a tremendous driver and measuring stick for business initiatives. 75% of respondents reported using specifications to drive quality compliance. After all, when you're measuring the quality of something, you have to compare it back to that initial spec, right? 64% have used it for cost savings initiatives. We have a lot of customer examples around this of how they're being more data driven and how they rationalize SKUs or rationalize packaging. 51% for regulatory compliance and 46% for RFPs. During COVID, we saw that a lot of our customers were going out to bid more frequently because they needed more suppliers, right? Demand was really surging for specific products, especially in the food and CPG space. So a lot of customers had to onboard new suppliers. The ability to do that is obviously very dependent on that specification and the ability to share it out quickly. Other notable uses were for sustainability tracking. Nancy, you mentioned that earlier. Performance testing, which I thought was interesting given the rise of e-commerce, maybe not too surprising. And I know that Nancy and Kyle will actually dive into this in a little bit. Finally, we asked, how confident are you in the accuracy of your current specifications? And what we found is that data accuracy is often in questions. While 35% of respondents did say they were confident in the accuracy of their data, most are unsure if the data they're using to make products and packaging is correct. 43% said they were somewhat confident, 12% said not so confident, 4% said not confident at all. I hope those people are contacting us, and 4% were unsure. Shout out to the 5% who were extremely confident, and the 31% who were very confident. But again, we're seeing just a wide swath across the board here. Nancy, this one really jumped out to me because what I often see is it's very clear that people in functional roles, and when I talk about functional roles, I mean packaging, product development, many of those people feel this pain deeply. Do executives know it's this bad?
You bet. That's a great question, Laura. You think about how does this get to the executive level and what drives change, and it really sometimes becomes a huge problem. And the categories of those problems are about missing revenue because I missed a launch date, because we're unorganized, we don't have our supply chain all organized. Then we've got delays in cost savings. Sometimes it is very difficult to leverage what you're buying, when you're buying it, how much you're paying for it, and you can't really pull all that together without specifications and specifications that are trustworthy. Then you've got slow new project development. How do you do that without documentation? So those are all examples that rise to the executive level. But functionally, the real pain shows quite a bit before you get to the executive level. So just real quickly, I can talk to some examples about what we're seeing in recent conversations that we're having with people who are interested in improving their spec management game. And it's really, think about quality control, and how do you know if your incoming products or materials or packaging items are coming in the door, you're measuring for quality, or you're getting a certification, and it's all fragment of where this information is going. So there's one example where SpecRite has aggregated this quality information and data. It shows up in a scorecard. It's visible for all the stakeholders to see, and then when it comes time for the review with a supplier, it's all in one place, and you can see when things were out of spec, on what date, and really hold your supplier accountable. And it's not about pointing a finger as much as it is about improving the continuous evolution of the relationship. So that's a great example of how SpecRite can be used for quality control. And then you've got cost control. So you go into an initiative, maybe every other year you're going out for an RFP for a particular packaging material type, say it's corrugated, which is a very common activity that people start with because it's typically the largest chunk of packaging spend for a lot of companies. And you have to take a number of weeks for the engineers to pull the specifications together, to aggregate the specifications, get them organized, understand where they're being used, what the volumes are, and then go to which suppliers are appropriate that can fulfill that RFP. And without all that organization, you've got weeks of time and effort that's wasted, and SpecRite just rolls that up easily. So the third one is something we've talked about a bit about already, and it's sustainability. So the tracking, the ability to have your baseline, and the ability to show results over time is what's required in some instances by law. So how would you do that if you didn't have a tool like SpecRite to really help you produce reliable and trustworthy data? So with all of that, I will share and pass the baton over to Kyle because he's got a recent Thermo Fisher success story to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to take a quick look in the rear view on a recent success story, as Nancy mentioned, with Thermo Fisher Scientific. Just to give you some background and some business context here, Thermo Fisher Scientific's portfolio was built up over a 30-year period while experiencing pretty significant growth during the same time period. Today, the spec count, I think, it exceeds about 5,000 in packaging materials, 2,800 of which are active materials. And as part of the work here, we loaded up that many into the SpecRite platform. In their make-to-order business, which is a little unique, the packaging team spent about 5 or so hours per week trying to locate specs that would work for their upcoming orders or their jobs coming through. And oftentimes they reach a dead end trying to find the right spec or application, and you find themselves creating a new spec for their application. And so, with the excessive time being spent and adding new specs, it resulted in data silos across the locations and across the organization. And so when they started recognizing that they had data silos forming and no real way to search for existing specs for the new jobs, they needed to do something about it. And so that, to solve their issue in the growing challenge, they invested in spec data management. One central hub helped create productivity and realize cost savings as a result of being able to use the like item finder in the tool, create visibility across the SKU portfolio, and find inventory that works for the applications. And then lastly, to take advantage of the data accuracy features, right, that the tool has in one central location. And so, this is a classic, poster child case study of what a SpecRite implementation can generate on a return, essentially. So you might be asking yourself, how do we get there, right? How do we get from here to there? The reality is it starts with a plan. Framing an action plan can really make the difference between a rapid turnaround on the platform compared to a lengthy, drawn-out process. These implementation timelines, they range. It depends on size and the overall complexity of your portfolio. Some implementations can be completed inside a 90-day period, compared to others that could extend to the 6 to 9 month range, according to some of the surveys internally that we did. To get the different departments up and running and integrated into the solution and get custom reports generated to meet the business needs, you need to plan for a little bit of a runway time on that first year investment to get up and running. Once you've established the timeline, the next piece is to commission a team that understands what the end goal is. This work can be completed, both in-house, or you can hire pros to do this work. While most implementations come in, all shapes and sizes in your business, we only need one composite team to stand up the solution on its feet and define all the processes that will lead to the quickest return on investment for your business. And then lastly, think about the types of benefits you'd like to gain out of the solution. A lot of our clients are, trying to determine, if their configuration needs to focus more on profitability or revenue enhancement, and it oftentimes, it falls from the pressures above, right, on what we're trying to accomplish. And in other times, it's both. right? And configuring your dashboards that meet both profitability and target.
That's such a great point, Kyle. And one thing that I often will say to customers or people looking at implementing a tool like SpecRite, it's that specification management isn't just an incremental step in managing your products and packaging. It's a fundamentally different approach. And what I mean by that is you don't want to take your current process and just digitize it, right? You actually want to rethink that process. Hey, maybe this doesn't have to be 15 steps. Maybe it can be 2 in SpecRite. And so I love this idea of, spending more time upfront and planning, know what you want to optimize for, and then rethink how you can use technology to get there instead of simply just replicating what you're doing today, right? So I think awesome insights here.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. This next piece here is, kind of looking at, how do we achieve maximum value from your investment? Oftentimes you're looking to, experience successes early on, and we highly recommend 4 shortcuts, if you will, that drive a strong return on investment. The first one here is getting help with the configuration. We want to be sure that, the most urgent business needs are being addressed. Secondly, getting help digitizing your specs so they are consistent and accurate in your system. Third is getting help with training your users to ensure a quick and easy transformation. And then lastly, get help with customizing simple reports and dashboards. This is really the bread and butter from my perspective of SpecRite, and it will save you lots of time compared to the traditional reporting methods and department roll-ups that you might experience in your businesses.
That's great, Kyle. And one of the biggest pain points we hear when talking to executives about specifications is the lack of reporting, right? Because when they're using all these different systems, there's no way to get that those reports and analytics. So I think that we're seeing this as a rising feature at every user level of the system. So great insights there.
A good starting point here to determine if spec data management is a fit for your business is to know where your business stands from a portfolio standpoint. We've provided a self-assessment, kind of a questionnaire to help you gain a better understanding of your packaging landscape and to offer up some tips for getting organized on your end. Finding answers to questions like the number of SKUs in your portfolio and how complex are those products and relationships, from a primary, secondary standpoint, and how many material types do you use, who interacts with the specs, how many internal stakeholders and suppliers are in the portfolio, right? All of those will help determine, where you'll find the biggest potential wins and where you may need help, with additional support to uncover the needs and to create an action plan. And, oftentimes you can start with your suppliers. And that it's good to know, what that landscape looks like from a starting standpoint, and doing a bit of a self-assessment will help kind of get you pointed in that direction. So this last piece, on vision for success, you oftentimes hear the phrase "hindsight is 20/20" when it comes to things you could have done differently on transformation projects. This is particularly fitting for clients that adopt spec data management and try to navigate the implementation on their own. In the end, we always get to hear about the many hard and soft benefits that the platform generates. However, the decision to outsource the implementation often comes down to how quickly can your business start recognizing the benefits. And so if you're just setting out on your journey for spec data management modernization, I'd like to encourage you to think about how your organization could benefit from quicker responses to your customers, the amount of time you could free up from the administrative burdens associated with specs, the time that it takes to report to stakeholders, and of course, ways to integrate spec data management that drives action on both continuous and periodic packaging improvement studies inside your business. And after all, we'd be thrilled to help your company spend less time searching and locating and more time innovating for your company and your bottom line.
That's great, Kyle. And I love that first point about responding to customers quickly to generate more revenue, because this is something we talk a lot about we're not just making the products for the sake of making products, right? We're making them for customers, and the changes and the desires of customers are happening so frequently that really systems like SpecRite can help companies keep up and respond to that even quickly. And not just make more products, but more profitable products, right? Leveraging components across multiple finished goods so that you can optimize for costs across your portfolio, things like that. People are getting quite sophisticated once they have the data in being able to generate, again, rapid responses to customers, but also more profitable products as well. So I know we covered a lot in 30 minutes. I do have a few questions that came in that we'll cover. And then, of course, we're also happy to continue to chat offline. So the first question we have is, when do you think the industry will fully transition away from manual spec management methods? Nancy, would love your thoughts on this one.
Oh my gosh, I wish I had a crystal ball. This is great. It seems like such a no-brainer and such an obvious thing to do immediately, yet everybody's got their prioritization list. But I have to say, spec management is now on that list. Whether it's number 1 or number 2 is the question. But I do think it's much sooner and much faster than it was prior to the pandemic. So we all realized weaknesses in supply chains as it's happened over the last 18 months. And so this is going to be a trend that's going to be fast and furious for some time in the short term.
Totally agree. Another one that we had that came in here, what's the most common question you hear from companies who are on the fence about using a spec management system?
Kyle, this is right up your alley.
Yeah, there are a few things that folks are asking about as it relates to the fence and where they fall. One thing I would like to bring to light is anytime that these decisions are being considered, oftentimes it involves getting the right resources and stakeholders involved in the decision making process. And so, frequently IT, can be a speed bump when it comes to, bringing on yet another system to manage. And I would say that that's probably right next to, how do we quantify a return on investment? Should we invest in this area?
That's great. One of the biggest reservations that I hear from people thinking about moving to a system like SpecRite is, they'll say, Laura, I just spent 15 minutes telling you my data is everywhere. How could we possibly do something like this, right? And that's really where the implementation comes in, using a partner like Chainalytics to help you kickstart that, and having a dedicated team whose job it is to gather that data for you. In fact, many of our customers give access to the SpecRite platform to their suppliers so that they can collaborate on this data upload across their supply chain. So, those are just some examples of questions you'll hear, but what we find is that the benefits far outweigh the challenges. And as Nancy mentioned, this is just the direction the industry is moving in general. Last question, is spec management worth it for smaller companies? The application of a larger company is pretty clear. Nancy, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'd love to. Absolutely. In fact, that's probably a preferable way to start, is start with key quality tools, helping you manage your business in a tight way, and using leading technology to do so. So SpecRite certainly scales, and it's a great way to start being a smaller scale.
I appreciate that. One of my favorite things when we work with challenger brands or mid-size or smaller organizations is that they're really digital natives. So they look at SpecRite really as the foundation for growing their business. And it always inspires me. And I think there's so many lessons that larger companies can learn from that, and how they're thinking about scaling their business using a very data-driven approach. So, spec management is for all sizes and all industries and things like that. So I want to thank both Nancy and Kyle for taking the time to talk about it. We could have spent all day talking about the state of specification management, but we only had 30 minutes. If you want to dive deeper, please contact us. You can reach me at laura@specrite.com and Nancy at nmatchy@chainalytics.com. We're happy to dive deeper on specification management, what it can mean for your organization, how it can help you solve some of your business problems. I want to thank Nancy and Kyle for joining us here today, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having us.